The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the Our Culture, Our Stories podcast are those of the individual hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of the NAACP or any affiliated organizations.
Education can come in many forms. Certainly
Right,
education can come
right.
in, a person going to college. But there are people, let's say, who are not in college, who may be starting a business, but they're reading more books than people who are in college, right? Or Malcolm X, when he was incarcerated, he was
Prison.
reading more books than professors. And so it is, I don't want people to just assume there's only one way to acquire knowledge, to study, to educate oneself. But however we're doing it, it's critically important.
Today's guest on NAACP Image Awards podcast series is Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, and he has been featured as one of Time's most influential people in the year, was it 2020? If I'm not mistaken. And he's also the author of several New York Times bestsellers, five of which were number one. We'd like to welcome Dr. Kendi to Our Culture, Our Stories, a NAACP Image Awards podcast. Thank you for being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any idea how many books there are behind you? Do you have any idea, if you had to guess, how many books are there in that bookcase behind you?
I have no idea.
If you had to
Probably,
guess.
I don't, 1,000. Um, yeah, 500, probably something somewhere between 500 and 1,000.
Wow. And I bet you read every single one of them, maybe a few times or more.
It's sort of my job as a scholar, and even as a writer, to try to ensure that I'm abreast on what people are conceiving, documenting, thinking.
You were born in Jamaica, Queens, is that correct?
So I was born, in Jamaica, Queens. Shout out to Jamaica, Queens.
Okay. What's it like growing up in Jamaica, Queens? How has that impacted the man that you've become?
I think I think growing up in Jamaica, Queens, at the time that I was in the 80s and 90s, was growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood, a neighborhood that was quite proud, a neighborhood of pretty significant both ethnic and class diversity. And so in many ways I got to be exposed to many different uh, groups of black people. At the same time, I got exposed to other people more or less making us into a monolith, so to
Mm,
speak. And I just think that in a way was an early education in the diversity and even the beauty of black people, while also an early education in the profound ignorance that
mm.
people have about that very beauty and diversity.
It's powerful. What does it mean for you to be recognized with the prestigious literary honors in such a grand way as a Black male author? I mentioned your bestsellers and being designated as one of the most influential people, et cetera. What does all that mean to you as a Black male author?
I think to think about the the literary honors, I've been fortunate enough to win, from book awards to sort of best-selling honors, particularly as a black author. I think is to think of it on multiple levels. I think first to recognize that in many ways our publishing system In many ways, our media system isn't necessarily set up, or I should say, is in many ways set up to exclude and devalue Black authors, no matter what we're saying, no matter what we're
Mm.
writing. And so to be one of those who have been able to move through many of those barriers is not for me to think of myself as extraordinary or better than other Black people, is in many ways to see myself as in many ways lucky, and trying to figure out ways to ensure that other Black people can navigate through those barriers so their stories can be told as well. And then also to think of myself, as a Black author, is to who has uh, been able to win some acclaim, is to, in a way, see a responsibility, a profound responsibility to share with the world, even Black people, that there's nothing wrong with Black people and everything wrong with those who think that there's something wrong with Black people.
Someone once said, and I don't know if it's fact or folklore, if you want to hide something from a Black man, put it in a book. What do you say about that?
I think so. Those who've said if you want to hide something from a Black man, put it in a book. I would actually adjust it to say if you want to hide something from a man or even a woman or even a person, you should probably put it, in a book.
Mm.
And I would say that largely because people are just less likely to read books than they are to watch television shows or to watch movies or to listen to music, and uh, and to consume many other forms of media, and reading a book, of course, requires a certain level of commitment that to a certain extent some people don't even have, right? For instance, if you're Black, you're more likely to have to work longer hours, you're more likely to be stressed, you're more likely to just want to go to sleep after you put your kids down. And so you may not have time or even interest to read a book, which I think makes it even more important for those of us as authors who are trying to write to and for Black people as well as others, who uh, to make our books as accessible and even interesting as possible, because so that when people decide to open up that book to do something, let's say they're not necessarily uh, they don't necessarily normally do, that they can be like, whoa, like this is going to be the start of something. I just don't want to read one book, I want to read more
Mhm.
books. And then the more books they read, the more they realize what's been hidden from them. And the more they realize what's been hidden from them,
Mm.
the more empowered and even liberated, they become. Because the more books that I've read, the freer I've felt, particularly intellectually.
Mm. The more books I've read, the freer I've felt. That's a powerful statement. What are your thoughts on the importance of celebrating Black achievement? And not just your thoughts, and why do you feel that way as it relates to your thoughts?
Well, I think about it on two levels. I think first, particularly as a scholar of racism, someone, I through my books, I document the history and even the enduring presence of racism. In many ways, if we think about racism as a structure in its totality, its ultimate objective is to essentially prevent Black people from achieving, is to deprive Black people of the opportunities and the resources to achieve. And so when an individual Black person or even a group of Black people achieve, it's a beautiful thing. In many ways, it's a miracle. And so I think, like
Mm.
with any other beautiful thing, any other miracle, we should celebrate. that achievement, as opposed to as Black people become envious or even jealous, of that achievement. And I also think, at a different level, because of the way racist ideas work, when one Black person achieves, people aren't necessarily seeing one Black person achieving. They're seeing the achievement of Black people. And so the way that operates is that then causes gatekeepers to likely believe
Mm.
that because that Black person achieved at that particular role, that you can achieve. So you actually elevating and praising that Black person, you're actually potentially creating some conceptual grounds for you yourself to receive an opportunity. And that's the unfortunate truth, the way that racist
Mm.
ideas deeply connect us. Um, but I think it's important for us to sort of understand that when we literally, particularly as Black people, uh, suppress the achievements of other Black people, we're ultimately and potentially suppressing our own opportunity to achieve.
Feels like amen goes right there. I want to talk
Exactly.
more about, yeah, I want to talk more about um, honoring Black achievement, the NAACP, Image Awards, etc. But before we get to that, racism from a personal standpoint, the first time that you recall dealing with racism, how old were you? And do you remember what happened? Where you were clear, oh, wow, I'm dealing with a very racist situation.
So my first memory, particularly of of even the recognition of racism,
Mhm.
was actually I believe I was ending the second grade, and my parents
Mm.
uh, were uh, we were looking for a new school, and we went to this school, and it was after school, and so there weren't really that many people there in terms of teachers and students. And so the teacher met us at the door and walked us down a long hallway uh, to her classroom. And on the outside of those classrooms, I could see pictures of the students and the teachers. And I noticed that almost all the students were Black and almost all the teachers were white. And so when we get into the classroom, this specific teacher, this third grade teacher, is actually Black. And so apparently, and this is largely as my parents narrated because I don't remember
Yeah,
it as
you were
clearly.
second grade.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so apparently, we when we sit down and start talking about the class, and my parents were asking the teacher questions, and at some point, I actually sort of burst in and asked the teacher, "Are you the only Black teacher in this class, in this school?" And then I followed it up with, "Why are you the only Black teacher, in this school?"
So you've been on this a long time.
I think so.
Yeah. The NAACP Image Award seeks to celebrate and elevate Black achievement across several categories. As you know, outstanding literary works have been recognized and awarded since the first award show in 1967. As a historian, activist, best-selling author, do you have any reflections or memories of the Image Awards that you could share with us? And why is it? I know we talked about honoring and celebrating Black achievement, but why is something like the NAACP Image Awards important?
Yeah. Well, first, I think the NAACP Image Awards are incredibly important because it is it is absolutely vital for Black people to celebrate the achievements of Black people in a society that structurally prevents Black people from achieving, and convinces Black people that when we don't achieve, we're not achieving due to the reasons why we did not achieve is because there's something wrong with us, as opposed to that
Mm,
structure, of racism. And we're constantly told, you know, uh, that we should be better or we didn't work hard enough, when in reality, it's typically racist policies and practices that are preventing us from achieving. But then when we somehow are able to achieve, as Black people, we face all sorts of hostility from those who do not believe Black people should be achieving because we're Black. And so, again, I think for the NAACP Image Awards to routinely and annually just celebrate, the achievements of Black people, is incredibly important, and particularly for those individuals who are honored each year. In a way, it doesn't just honor them; it really arms them to continue on uh, being their best selves and doing their best work in a deeply racist society. And I can remember the first time I was nominated for an NAACP Image Award was for my book Stamped from the Beginning. And I came to the ceremony, I believe in 2017, and I was just blown away by
mm,
just the experience, the experience of celebration, and particularly because I'd just written a book and spent the whole year narrating a book about racist ideas, anti-Black racist ideas, about all the things that purportedly were wrong with Black people, and to sort of
mhm.
witness a celebration about all the things that are right, about Black people, was deeply fulfilling for me.
Thank you. From July 2023 to December of 2023, just those, what is that, 5 months, over 4,300 books were banned as reported across 23 states. Your work often focuses on championing for educated and telling authentic stories about Black people, especially about anti-racism and race theory. Dr. Kendi, are you concerned about your work being censored or banned? Have you thought about that?
So I am deeply concerned about, my work being banned. Last I checked, I believe I had 7 or 8 different books that have been banned or challenged. And to think, particularly as somebody who grew up in the 80s and 90s in Jamaica Queens, and I wasn't necessarily a big reader, and
Mm,
and so to think that particularly some of the books that I've written for young people, have been sort of snatched out of their hands and snatched out of their libraries and snatched out of their classrooms because they dare to say to a Black child that there's nothing wrong with you, or they dare to narrate the experience of that Black child on the page. I mean, is just nothing short, of enraging. But then again, it is deeply American, which is to say, when Black people wrote books sort of describing the horror of segregation, those books were banned in Mississippi and Florida. When Black abolitionists wrote books and pamphlets uh, uh, sort of challenging slavery, those books and pamphlets were banned. I'm thinking about in 1829, a Boston abolitionist named David Walker wrote an appeal to the
mm,
colored citizens of the world, in which he encouraged enslaved Black people to rise up and fight their enslavers. And he stitched those pamphlets into the clothes of black sailors and sent them south, and had those pamphlets spread throughout the South. And enslavers went absolutely mad,
Crazy.
even, put a bounty, on his head for daring to say that slavery was wrong, just as, we're being targeted for daring to say that racism is wrong.
What is, in your opinion, the big fear in Black folks knowing the truth about their abilities, their power, their creativity? Because obviously, if you're banning books, it's because you don't want people to understand, right? Among other things. What is the danger, do you feel, your opinion on that as it relates to people understanding who they are and what they possess? What's the danger?
So I've written a number of books that document the history of racist ideas, particularly anti-Black racist ideas. And these are ideas suggesting that Black people are dangerous, or Black people are lazy, or Black people are ugly, or Black people are irresponsible. And most of these ideas were produced by white people. And the more that I studied the history of anti-Black racist ideas and their production, the more that I began to see that, yes, these ideas were produced by, let's say, enslavers for the consumption of white people up north who are not enslaving people. But these ideas, these racist ideas, have also been produced historically for Black people. In other words, to convince Black people that they should be enslaved, or that they should be impoverished, or that they should be breaking less than people, of different racial groups. In other words, as a Black person, if you have internalized racist ideas that there's something wrong with Black people, and then you look out at the fact that Black people are more likely to be impoverished, more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to be dying of heart disease and cancer, more likely to be kicked out of school, less likely to own a home, less likely to have wealth, you're not going to see a problem. Or if you see a problem, you're going to see the problem as Black people. So you're actually not going to resist those who actually created those ideas. In other words, they created those ideas. The way those ideas function is they eliminate the resistance to racism. And it causes an individual who's Black to look in the mirror and see a problem, as opposed to looking out in society and its rules and seeing the problem.
Can you speak to the importance of education within advocacy? Your PhD, master's, you've checked all the box. Do you believe literature and knowledge can be an act? And do you believe literature and knowledge can also be an act of resistance? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think when it comes to literature and knowledge, being sort of an act of resistance, yeah, I think that it isn't a coincidence that throughout American history, uh, those who have been trying to conserve racism have also been banning books, have also been banning literature, has also been preventing Black people from having access to high quality schools with a tremendous amount of resources. It's not a coincidence that they've been starving our educational institutions, of of resources. To me, it's not a coincidence. And the reason being is because it is very, very difficult to eliminate any structure, any problem, if you don't understand it, if you haven't studied it, if you don't have knowledge about it. And I think we as Black people, we can have and we certainly do have knowledge about our own lived experience. In other words, what's happened to us personally and even people we know. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have knowledge about why that happened, and the rules and structures and power that caused that to happen. And and so that's where knowledge and literature, and books and education, can come into play. And that's why it's critically important, um, for us to deeply educate ourselves, as we seek to, free ourselves. And education can come in many forms. Certainly
Right, right,
education can come
right.
in, a person going to college. But there are people, let's say, who are not in college, who may be starting a business, but they're reading more books than people who are in college, right? Or Malcolm X, when he was incarcerated, he was
Prison.
reading more books than professors. And so it is, I don't want people to just assume there's only one way to acquire knowledge, to study, to educate oneself. Um, but however we're doing it, it's critically important.
Did you know that this would be the trajectory of your life? When did you know that? And if you weren't doing this, what would you be doing? What would Dr. Ibram X. Kendi be doing?
So I had no idea this was going to be the trajectory of my life. I think this still is all shocking and new, to
Mm.
me, and I think to a certain extent that keeps me sort of grateful and humble. I think if I wasn't a scholar, I probably would have been a sports writer. So actually, I went to FAMU,
Mm.
uh, envisioning or inspiring to be a sports writer. And when I was there, I started doing internships at different newspapers, and the more I interned in sports writing, and the more I got to cover professional athletes and college athletes and other athletes, the more it became uninteresting, and the more interested I became in actually writing about race and racism, which ultimately sort of led me down this path.
Interesting. Interesting. Dr. Kendi, the sports writer. Who would you, what team would you think you'd most enjoy covering if you were doing that? I'm just curious. It's not in my notes, but
Yeah, so if I became a sports writer, I would have dreamed to cover the my favorite professional team, which is the New York Knicks.
okay. I assumed we were doing New York. I thought that I would have been surprised had that not been the case. So many great Black authors have used their work as a means of resistance, empowerment, and education. How do you use your work to hold a mirror up to the world around you and reflect the realities of being a Black man in the world today?
Well, I mean, like other Black authors, historically and currently, particularly those who have decided that they're going to write about the complexity of Black life or about racism. I try to uh, ensure that my books are incredibly well researched, and so that uh, uh, there's a lot of sort of uh, nuance and even complexity, but also simultaneously ensuring, and the reason being is because Black life, or what it means to be Black, or what Black people experience, is deeply complex. Like there's sort of no one way to share the stories of in the lives and experiences and even the history, of Black people. And so I try to ensure that my books have that, multi-layered in that sense, and are inclusive of the multitude of experiences of Black people. and that those experiences that I share are well documented and cited, and people can go and learn more. But then also, it's incredibly accessible. And so, it's the type of book, even if it's longer, that pretty much anybody can pick up and read and gather. Even though I'm a scholar and an academic, I don't write for other academics. I write for regular people.
Mm.
And because regular people, particularly regular Black people, are experiencing racism, and I want to give them the intellectual tools to understand it and fight it.
Which of your books would you say has been your favorite yet to date, and why?
So asking what's my favorite book is like asking what's my favorite child.
Favorite child? Yeah, I know. I
So
know.
it's
Yeah.
a difficult. I mean, I probably would say How to Be an Anti-Racist is my favorite, and and I think the reason why I would say it's my favorite is because in many ways it was by far the hardest book to write. Uh, and it was incredibly hard to write because so much of the book is about my own sort of personal story, particularly my story of how I ended up internalizing ideas that there was something wrong with Black people, and how I was able to ultimately recognize that and begin to sort of adopt more anti-racist ideas. Uh, and so just trying to be that vulnerable, um,
Mm, mm,
particularly in our society where, uh, particularly those of
mhm.
us who study racism, we are supposedly not supposed to uh, shine a light on those individual Black people who are reinforcing the structure of racism. And that, in a way, internalized racist ideas is a closeted issue. We're not supposed to talk about that publicly. And um, and so for me to sort of be willing to do that, but then also connect those ideas to who produced them, the white people who produced them, why they produced them, um, the way they reinforce policies and structures. Um, I mean, it was just incredibly, I had to be quite vulnerable, and it was even incredibly difficult, to write.
Mhm.
And I was even scared to write it because, I knew I was going to be pushing up against many conceptions, or I should say conventions. And the book became very controversial as I thought. But that also makes it my favorite because it was so hard to write, and because there's so many different viewpoints about the book, particularly from those who've never read it.
That part, that part, particularly those who've never read it. You mentioned being scared. You mentioned vulnerability, being vulnerable. That's a thing as it relates to Black men in general every day. Been a Black man a long time. And that's a thing. That's a big thing. The the not necessarily being excited about being vulnerable. Where does that come from? And how does that hinder us, in your opinion?
I think for as a Black man, I think the fear of being vulnerable, I think, comes from many different levels. I think on one level, we're told as men that to be vulnerable is to be weak, and to be weak is to not be a man. And so, of course, we want to affirm our masculinity by not being weak and thereby not being
Mm,
vulnerable. And
mm,
and then I think simultaneously, one of the oldest racist ideas about Black men in particular has been this notion of the weak Black male. And the way that sort of operates is because racist ideas situate the superior man as strong, who is white, then the opposite of the quote superior white male is the weak black male. And that weak
Mm,
black male stands side by side the supposed strong black woman who, because she's considered strong and a woman, it's imagined that she's not really a woman because to be a good woman apparently is to be weak. And so, but this construct of a weak black male also causes black men to be like, no, I'm strong. I'm going to fight and push back against, that idea, particularly because of, sexist notions that to be a man is to be strong. Um, and so I think that sort of operates both on a gendered, and racial level. And then when you combine that with how difficult it is to be a black male in a society in which pretty much everyone, uh, even including some black men, fear black men,
mm.
and in a society in which you're perceived to be less than, you're perceived to not necessarily have ability, you're only really perceived to be good at physical attributes or activities, um, and those physical acts and abilities aren't necessarily conducive to being vulnerable. It again, I think it reinforces why it's so hard for us, as black men to be vulnerable.
So how do we suffer as a result of that, do you think?
Well, I think one of the ways we suffer as black men, because we have been socialized to not be vulnerable, is that uh, our sort of internal well-being, uh, and what that meaning like our emotional state,
Mhm.
what we're feeling, uh, what we're even thinking, how we're responding and negotiating when we're harassed by the police or we're fired at our job, when we're not really sharing what we're feeling based on what's happening to us, and we're sort of bottling it up. uh, I think that undermines our emotional health, our physical health. It potentially could even lead to higher levels of depression and anxiety. I mean, I keep coming back to these recent studies that find that as black men rise on the economic ladder, they're actually more likely to be depressed or face levels of
Mm.
anxiety. And there's no other racial ethnic group where that's the case. And so it's it can become quite difficult, and because we're not willing to really share what's really going on with us internally with people who love us, who then can help us and help us guide, because we don't want to seem weak. Um, and in many
Mm.
ways, we can't be weak and survive in this deeply racist society.
Who's inspired you? What other authors uh, do you read, or you read somebody else's piece and you said, wow, that was life changing? Because you said you weren't much of a reader when you were younger. And so that changed at some point. What what brought about that change, and who inspires you? Who do you read?
So I read quite, in terms of who inspires me and who I read quite widely, from authors who, are no longer with us, like Maya Angelou and
Mm,
um, Malcolm X and W.B. Du Bois um, and James Baldwin, to, writers who graciously are with us, like Nicole Hannah Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates and
mm,
uh,
mm,
Imani Perry, and Dorothy Roberts, and so it is, each of these writers and many more have not only inspired me intellectually, but even how they approach their craft, as writers, as thinkers, has inspired me.
Good stuff. In your opinion, what kind of Black stories, Dr. Kendi, are missing from our book shelves? What kind of Black stories are still missing, in your opinion? And then what's next on the horizon for you?
So I think in terms of the Black stories that are missing, I would say those stories of um, in which Black imperfections are normalized. And so I think we can have this scenario in which we have Black stories that, in a way, seek to almost sort of normalize some sort of negativity because that's what the maker thinks of Black people. Or we could have stories that try to show Black people as extraordinary because it's believed that that's the only way to undermine racist ideas, particularly, or even that first narrative, as opposed to a Black person who is acting negatively and positively, because that's what Black people do. And why do Black people act negatively and positively? Because Black people are human. And to be human is to be imperfect, and that's really what makes us equal to other imperfect groups. So I always encourage creators to think about those types of Black stories. And then I would also say just Black stories, and maybe this is just my bias, but Black stories from history of Black people doing, in many ways, the impossible,
Mm,
particularly overcoming impossible odds. And the reason why those stories to me are just very inspirational to Black people is because so much of our life is having to overcome impossible odds. And so the more we see those types of stories, the more we face down the impossible odds, in our own lives, um, and seek to push past through them, no matter what.
thank you. What's next on the horizon for you, and how can we support you and other Black authors and activists, in addition to, of course, buying the books?
I think next on the horizon, I think I'm going to be in this year in 2025, I'm be coming out with two books. I can't really share much about these books, but what I can share is one is for young people and one is for adults. And so I'm really excited about both of these projects
Mm,
that I've been working on for quite some time. And I think the one of the ways to support Black authors and writers, particularly in this moment, is certainly to not only get our books, but also recognize that we are constantly under attack. We're constantly being maligned and misrepresented, and it whenever a Black author sees someone standing up for them and defending them, it really helps on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that can go a long way, because then you as a Black author, you're not alone. Your community is there for you, fighting with you and for you, so you can really focus on your next book, as opposed to trying to sort of beat back those bad actors who are trying to stop you from writing, and
mm.
stop Black literature from being produced.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the Our Culture, Our Stories podcast are those of the individual hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of the NAACP or any affiliated organizations.